So here we go. Okay, so we'll go ahead and we'll get started. So I'll open us up with prayer, and we'll jump right in. God, we are grateful to be here to step once again into a discussion, into struggles with the text that we have before us. And God, I pray that tonight would be a night filled with surprise, filled with new understanding. And God, that we would also continue to have questions. And Lord, we pray all of these things in your Son's name. Amen. Amen. Okay, so just kind of thinking through like some of the stuff that we've already talked about. Is there anything that was still troubling you from the last couple weeks, or is there anything that you kind of want to think about now that you want to make sure that we don't leave off the table as we've been talking about Nahum? There's one thing that we did kind of do, and so I'm so sorry for whoever's watching this later. But I want to have like a parking lot of stuff. So dates are important. Okay, so we've got to do some dates on Jonah. This is not very good. I always do that. I grab the wrong marker that doesn't have any ink in it. So Jonah, dates, and Nahum. Because that's important to know what's going on, and because you've got two very different texts, right? And so that was already brought up. Like, how could these be so different, right? So we'll talk about that. Anything else that was kind of like, from the last couple of weeks or from Nahum so far?
Just reading the first chapter of Nahum, God comes across as one bad man, and the way they describe it.
I know, yeah. So the God that you see revealed in Nahum is not at all like the God that you see sort of in Jonah, right? Yeah. This is going to be part of our discussion tonight and next week, the week after that. Okay. All right, so let's just jump in real quick. We're going to talk about real quickly, just kind of going over again some of the things that we're going to be using to dig into the text. So we use literary criticism, which we're definitely going to be using tonight, because it's the foundation of an argument that I'm going to be making for the dates. Form criticism, probably not so much tonight, maybe a little. Historical criticism, definitely. This is all about the history and the setting and what's going on. We're going to be doing a lot of that. There's probably going to be some ideological criticism as well, because you're going to be having a definite cultural bias that is this full-on display in Nahum, right? We had that bias in Jonah, that Jonah exhibited against the Ninevites. But here, it's not just the narrator, it's not just the people of Israel, sort of, right? The prophet that has that cultural bias. It's God. God has the cultural bias against the Ninevites. And then structural criticism, maybe a little bit as we kind of talk about the prophetic sort of role of the prophet and what the prophet is doing here. Okay, so our thesis, once again, that confronting rather than avoiding conflicting views of God in Scripture is an essential part of biblical engagement that offers a path to a more fully developed understanding of God. So rather than avoiding the conflicts, rather than avoiding the fact that you've got these disparate views within the text, we're gonna wrestle with it, right? We're gonna deal with it. We're gonna talk about it, because that's what gives us a more full understanding of God. You're never gonna get to a complete and full understanding of God, right? Because the moment that you start thinking and saying that I'm starting to understand God is the moment that you've diminished any understanding of God that you might have, right? It's like, it's just kind of how it works, right? The moment you speak of it, you've already limited it, right? You've limited God by speaking of God. But that's what we have to do, so we use metaphor. I think I wrote about this in one of the daily devos that came out not too long ago, about poets and poetic language. And so that's very important for what we're doing today. poetic language is a huge part of what Nahum is doing. And so, that is the best and probably the most helpful way to speak of God is with metaphor, and to use poetic language. Which poetic language, uses all kinds of other things too, simile and so forth. But that's the sometimes it's all we've got, right? Is to be able to kind of speak of God that way. So there's a whole bunch of that going on as well. Okay, so in contrast to some of the texts that we had in Jonah, the key verse there that I pulled out was the very first one that sets the tone, right? So Nahum 1:2, the Lord is a passionate, avenging God. The Lord is vengeful and fierce in wrath. The Lord takes vengeance on his enemies. He rages against his foes. Wow. That sucks. Okay, so let me do just a little bit of history stuff. You've got the outline there, but I'm going to kind of work through the outline and just kind of talk through it so that you can understand a little bit of the history of Assyrians in Israel. Okay, so the origins of the city of Nineveh actually are traced in the Jewish mindset back to Nimrod, all right? So Nimrod, besides being kind of a derogatory term that maybe had its origins in the 50s or 60s, that calling somebody a Nimrod, I don't know where it came from. How many of y'all, that was a thing, when you were growing up, calling somebody a Nimrod, But the interesting thing is that Nimrod was a mighty hunter, a mighty warrior, right? And so there is a school somewhere in America that are the Fighting Nimrods. And they have as their mascot, this warrior, ancient warrior looking guy. So Nimrod was a mighty warrior that also was a city builder. So this is, again, kind of that thing that we were sort of brushing up against, the idea of cities and the anxiety that comes from, the cities that become more powerful and all of that kind of stuff. So, and cities that then have alliances or then are conquered and, all those kinds of things are all part of that. But Nimrod is a despot warrior and founder of cities. And so that already, right? So in the origins, according to the Jewish people and their traditions and their, even their own mythologies to a certain extent, they're already assigning a negative role to the city of Nineveh, right? So its origins, according to them, come out of, bad stuff, right? So it's got a terrible foundation. Okay, so as far as the Assyrians go, Tiglath-Pileser III, whose nickname was Pul, in 734 BCE conquers Gaza. Now Gaza, you've heard about Gaza, right? So this is still a city. It was a city then. It's still a city, right? It was a Philistine city. It was originally conquered and settled by the Philistines, and it's on the coast. So that was kind of fit with them because they were seafaring people that came over and then began to settle and conquer inland and getting all the way as far as very, very close to the Judean wilderness and so forth. And so when the Philistines have their kind of Waterloo moment is with David and Goliath, and that is in the valley of Elah, which is in the southern part of the kingdom of Israel at that point. And so they're kind of moving their way up, trying to get up. Now, these are seafaring people, and now they're having to fight in the hills. And so the place that they picked was a valley to fight against Saul and the Israelites. And so they each have high ground on either side of this valley, and neither one of them is willing to give it up. And that's where Goliath goes out and starts taunting everybody. So he was from Gath, which was one of the cities of the Philistines, but Gaza was another one. And so Gaza then is conquered by Tiglath-Pileser. Now, why would Tiglath-Pileser III be interested in Gaza? Why would he care? Because Gaza is located right next to one of the great superpowers of the ancient world? Anybody want to guess where that might be? Think pyramids. Egypt, right? So if you hold a city that is basically on the trade route, part of the trade route, and now you've got a toehold. So this is where the Assyrians are beginning to, and they even eventually they will wage war against the Egyptians. The Egyptians and Assyrians kind of go at it back and forth. And so Israel becomes like a football in the midst of all this. Sometimes actually then making alliances with Egypt. And even when the superpowers change, right, from Assyrian to Babylonian, they make an alliance with Egypt. Egypt doesn't keep their part of the bargain, which is why in the Psalms and some of the prophetic books, there's all these warnings about putting your trust in alliances, putting your trust in the horse and chariot rather than in the strong right arm of God and so forth. Because Nebuchadnezzar goes right by Israel, goes and beats Egypt in a decisive battle, and then comes back and then sacks Jerusalem and destroys the temple. So all that stuff happened as well. So right now, though, we're before that. And so Tiglath-Pileser conquers Gaza. Then, so this is now dangerously close to the kingdom of Judah, which is in the south where Jerusalem is, right? So if you can picture your Bible when you were growing up and you had that little map at the very beginning of your Bible, right? You opened your Bible up, some of you still have it, and it has like the little Sea of Galilee and then the Jordan River and the Dead Sea, right? So Jerusalem is kind of just north of the Dead Sea. In the Judean wilderness, in the hillside, in the hills of Judea. And so it's getting close, right? So you're talking, the Assyrians are starting. Sorry, people. My apologies. I'm going to move this back just a tad. There we go. That's what I was trying earlier when I was like waving my arms. I was like, am I going to hit it? Of course. Okay, so then in 722, Shalmaneser the Fifth sacks the northern kingdom, right? So remember, for those of you who, I say remember, like some of you may have no clue about what I'm talking about. It's okay. For those of you who grew up fundamentalist and Baptist like me, you remember all this stuff, right? Because it was ground into your head, but then you had no application. But anyway, so the kingdom of Israel was broken off into two kingdoms. So after Solomon, the great King Solomon, his son took over, and his son was an idiot. Solomon did some bad stuff. I mean, let's just be clear. Solomon enslaved his own people, used slave labor to build the temple and his own palace. I mean, he was not, and plus, what is it, 900 concubines or something like that, and 700 women. The guy got around. I mean, he had a lot going on, but he was still considered a great king to a certain extent, right? Because he strengthened the kingdom of Israel. They fortified a ton of cities all over the place, including Megiddo, where we all know Megiddo is the place where it's a Har Megiddo, and that's where the Battle of Armageddon allegedly is going to be fought. But that is a symbolic place where all kinds of battles were fought. So Solomon fortifies all these cities. He had built a great empire, and then his son just destroys everything because he was an idiot. And so the kingdom then breaks in two. So the northern kingdom, the 10 tribes in the north, break away from him. They actually create their own worship center and do their own thing for quite some time. So we talk about some of the kings that were around during this time period. So you've got like Ahab. King Ahab, who was like the most famous. That's all part of the northern kingdom. And so the southern kingdom remains after Shalmaneser destroys the northern kingdom. But then in 701, Sennacherib comes and he devastates Judah. So King Hezekiah is the king then. So King Hezekiah, if you go to the old city of Jerusalem, there's a couple of things that you can do. Some of you guys may have done this when you went with me. I don't know. Who went in Hezekiah's tunnel while we were there? Yeah, where you walked through. Okay, so So Hezekiah fortified the city of Jerusalem like in a hurry, and so you can go and actually see some of the walls that he fortified, like even kind of taking the walls and running it right through somebody's house, that kind of stuff. As they were quickly trying to fortify the city against the Assyrians, and they redid the entire water system, creating a tunnel. And it was a feat of unbelievable engineering of people digging through basically limestone, and then they were off by like just it was like millimeters, difference. So it's pretty crazy, and the water flowed from the well and so forth. So they were under siege essentially. So if you go to Chicago, to the Oriental Institute, which is in near the city, the University of Chicago on the south side. So Oriental University, there's like an obelisk that has like all of this written on it, right? So this is Sennacherib's version. So this is what Sennacherib says. As for Hezekiah the Jew, who did not submit to my yoke, 46 of his strong-walled cities, as well as the small cities in their neighborhood, which were without number, by leveling with battering rams, and by bringing up siege engines, by attacking and storming on foot, by mines, tunnels, and breaches, I besieged and took 200,150 people, great and small, male and female, horses, mules, asses, camels, cattle, and sheep without number. I brought away from them and counted as spoil. Himself, like a caged bird, I shut up in Jerusalem, his royal city. As for Hezekiah, the terrifying splendor of my majesty overcame him, and the Urbi, the Arabs, and his mercenary troops, which he had brought in to strengthen Jerusalem, his royal city, deserted him. So the Bible tells a little bit of a different story. So it tells how Sennacherib's field commander stood before the walls of Jerusalem and uttered the blasphemous boast that Assyria's gods were stronger than the God of Judah. He demanded the surrender of the city. After this, the emperor himself sent Hezekiah a letter saying, "Do not let the God you depend on deceive you when he says Jerusalem will not be handed over to the king of Assyria. Surely you have heard what the kings of Assyria have done to all the countries, destroying them completely. And will you be delivered? Did the gods of the nations that were destroyed by my forefathers deliver them?" And Hezekiah spread this letter before the Lord in the temple and prayed for deliverance. And so Isaiah sent a message saying that God would deliver the people. And that night the angel of the Lord went out and put to death 185,000 men in the Assyrian camp. This so weakened Sennacherib's army that he returned to Nineveh without achieving the capitulation of Jerusalem. Interesting, right? I've seen the obelisk. So it exists, it's real, it's a thing. And that's Sennacherib's version, and then you have the version that's in the text. So, that's not part of this class, but obviously there's a conflict between what Sennacherib said happened and what the scripture says. Here's the thing. Would Sennacherib admit that something happened that caused him to leave?
No.
Heck no, right? And is it possible that maybe the Israelites, made it a lot bigger than it was? Yes, right? So there's probably in the middle of that is something, worth holding on to. But something obviously happened that kept Sennacherib from destroying Jerusalem. But he did turn Hezekiah into a vassal, so to speak. So Hezekiah paid tribute. But it is quite possible that something happened. It would have never gone into his chronicles, obviously. So here's the history that exists between the Israelites and Assyria. So it's not a good one, right? So you got years and years and years of being kicked around, of being subjugated, of being besieged, of cities being destroyed, people being taken away as slaves, livestock, goods, all the rest of it, right? So you're kind of at the whim of these empires, and especially the Assyrians, who were especially nasty, as I mentioned. So here's what happens, though. In the year 612, maybe 613, Nineveh was conquered by the Medes and the Babylonians. And it was laid to waste. So 90 years after the invasion of Judah, Nineveh is destroyed and is never really inhabited again. I mean, in the way that it was. I mean, the area is still a city. I mean, it's still a city in Iraq, but it's not the same, obviously. There's ancient stuff there, but it was never inhabited in the same way. So what happened that caused Nineveh to be conquered, this great city? Well, there was a calamity that occurred, actually. There was a Greek historian that was writing in like the year 60 BC. And he writes about the sacking of Nineveh and what happened. So the Tigris River, the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, create something called the Fertile Crescent, which is like kind of a lot of people believe that's where everything sort of began to a certain extent. But that whole area, the Tigris and the Euphrates River, the Tigris floods, because Nineveh was on the river, like a lot of the great cities were. The Tigris floods, and so it breaks down part of the walls of the city and begins to inundate the city. Okay? So the guy that is the king, Sardanapalus, right? Sardanapalus, he remembers an oracle that is about how the river will declare war on Nineveh, which will then bring about the destruction of Nineveh. And so at that point, he gathers inside one of his great treasure rooms inside of his palace. He gathers his concubines, his wives, his eunuchs, and all of his treasure, and burns everyone and himself alive, including all the treasure, to destroy it. The end. Okay. So that happened in 612, 613, right? So that happens. And so then we have Nahum, right? Okay, so the interesting thing about Nahum and where he's going with this is a lot of prophets, right? When you read through some of the prophets, you will hear like indictments against Babylon, indictments against Egypt, indictments against, Moab and all these other, like anybody that ever crossed Israel gets an indictment, right? But there's also indictments of Israel, right? There's a self-critique that's within it. Now they might be saying, oh, these nations were used as the instrument of God's punishment and so forth. Something that we often continue to do, right? And so they might have said that, but there's a critique of Israel. There's a critique of Judah as being not sort of faithful. Now we know that this is a time period within which there was some things to critique that Nahum could have been critiquing, right? That there were, archaeological evidence suggests that there was some worship of other gods and so forth that was still going on, which kind of was a constant problem in the ancient Middle East, and the people of Israel struggle with this. Wanting to be like everybody else, and superstitions die hard and that kind of thing. But there's no rebuke in Nahum of anybody except Nineveh. And so this is called a matzah, or just an oracle, or in one of the versions that I have, it was a portend or a portent. So what this is really is it's responding to and anytime there's an oracle, anytime there's a prophecy, anytime there's something like that, what they're responding to, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Daniel, Ezekiel, all of them, all of the prophets. They're responding to feelings of doubt about what God intends in a particular situation. And so the prophecy clarifies it. So what do we do that's the same thing, essentially? Well, when horrible things happen in the world, what do we tend to try to do? Justify it, explain it, attach meaning. We want to try to figure out what happened here. There's got to be a reason, that's what most of us try to do. I believe that things just happen. That's kind of what I believe. I think that that there are things that occur within tragedies and so forth where God works God's will and way, and so there are things that can be resurrected and restored out of that. But in terms of like, do things happen for a reason? That's kind of difficult. And when somebody, like when you've had somebody that was tragically killed, or a horrible thing that just happened, like in Virginia Beach with another dang shooting, to go and tell a loved one, or to go and tell these grieving people, well, everything happens for a reason. I mean, they're like, what? And sometimes people just do that, right? They want to believe so firmly that everything happens for a reason that they, even though they are grieving, they will say everything happens for a reason. So I think that in those moments, we're trying to figure that out. And the prophets spoke into those moments, right? They've spoke into them. Sometimes explaining what has happened, like attaching meaning to it, which I believe is what is happening here in Nahum. Or they're speaking into a moment and saying, if this doesn't change, here's what's going to happen, right? Or if you do this, then it's going to be this way, right? So they're giving you an outcome in one respect, where they're saying there's a condition here that I'm just sort of I'm helping you to fill in the blanks of whatever doubt that you're experiencing in this moment. So prophets will speak to things that they feel like are going to happen. If they see something down the road, like Isaiah, Jeremiah began to prophesy, saying, this is not good. You've got to, to the king, you've got to stop going into alliances with Egypt. This is not going to end well. The Babylonians are going to kick our butts. It's best just to give up and just pay the tribute. And I mean, they were basically just suing for peace, right? That's what the prophets were trying to do. And no one listened to them. In fact, they put Jeremiah like into a cistern, like in the gutter, in the sewer. So all those kind of bad things then happened. Everything that Jeremiah had said was going to happen happened, right? So there's something else going on here. Okay, so here's the thing about dates. If you go and you start digging around, you're going to find that there's a couple of dates that are possible for Nahum. One of them is 663, I think. And so the people who want. And there's nothing wrong with this. So if there's somebody that's their desire, is to say this is a prophecy of what is going to happen, and that indeed happened. So the prophet was prophesying and it came true that Nineveh was destroyed, right? So what is 63 minus, so you're talking 50 years, right? So 50 years before it happens, the prophet is saying this is what's going to happen. So that's perfectly fine. I mean, it really is, because, in those days, it's not hard to come up with really interesting poetic language to describe the destruction of a city, because you've got that language. You've seen it happen, right? There have been plenty of cities that have been destroyed in similar fashion. And so, it's not outside of the realm of possibility that the person that we don't know anything about Nahum, so whoever Nahum was, is prophesying ahead of time and saying this is going to happen, right? There doesn't seem to be any redemption in that prophecy. There's no condition. There's no, like, if Nineveh repents and changes, they're going to be, it's like, this is going to happen. Nineveh's finally going to get theirs, huzzah, right? So, but it's possible that Nahum was prophesying in 663 or so. But it's also possible that Nahum was prophesying after the fact, okay, and explaining what happened. Okay, it doesn't take away from the power of the text either way, but it's an interesting kind of intellectual argument. Here's why I think it's the later date, because the work itself, and this is where we're going to do a little bit of form criticism. The work itself is half of it is an acrostic poem. Do you guys know what an acrostic poem is? Okay, so acrostic poem for us would be the first line of the poem would begin with A, the second line would begin with B, the third line would begin with C. So the same thing is true in Hebrew. So you just go through the Hebrew alphabet. So it dies away. There's problems though, because it dies away in verse 4, and then it's resurrected again, and verse 7, it leaves out some stuff, but it's an attempt, at least, at an acrostic poem. Perhaps earlier versions of it, were more complete, who knows. But Why is that important? Well, if it's an acrostic poem, then it becomes something different than prophecy, like kind of technically. If it's an acrostic poem, then it's taking the form of liturgy. Okay? It's become like a song. It's become a hymn. It's become something that you would sing or you would proclaim. So there's a liturgical sort of aspect to it. Yep.
Can't you see after the exile, then the Jewish writers began to say, why did this happen?
Right.
And so they were explaining after it happened instead of prophesying ahead of time.
They were. Now, the form of those prophecies, which they would still be considered prophetic work, because they're looking back and then looking forward and saying, now this is why you must do this, right? So the difference between those would be the form, right? The form of this is liturgical, at least part of it, and so here's why that's really interesting. Okay, so if you go back to the book of Exodus, okay, and so Moses leads the people of Israel across the Red Sea. The waters dry up. They walk across dry land. They get across, and then he drops, and Yul Brynner's army is destroyed. Right? So at that point, there's some liturgy that is created that then is sung, all right, by Miriam, and it's a celebration, right? The horse and the rider, our dad, blah, blah, blah. That kind of song is actually echoed, that same kind of liturgical, kind of form is echoed by Mary in what's called the Magnificat, where she goes back and starts talking about, I totally sounded Canadian then, right? Starts talking about how, again, the bringing back up the pharaohs, the chariots and the rider, the horse and rider are washed over and submerged and so forth, drowned. And so there's a liturgy there. So the celebration for Mary is that suddenly everything is going to be made right.
They're teaching the history.
Right. So they're using the defeat of their enemies, the defeat of their enemies to make a point then about who God is and how mighty God is. And there's a worshipful sort of element in that. So I've said all that to say this, that's why I think that it was written in the later period, because the author is creating something that's kind of quasi-liturgical as celebration of what God has done to defeat the enemies of God, which coincidentally are the enemies of Israel. So there you go. Okay, so now that we've done all that, let's actually get into the text, okay? So I'm going to be reading from a different translation. So this is actually a Jewish study Bible, and so this is not an NIV. This is not an NRSV. This is from the Jewish Publication Society, the Tanakh translation. All right, so it's a little different, right? But not that different. All right, so I'm going to kind of go through some of this exegetical work together. So exegesis is something that you do in seminary to drive you crazy, as Kelly can attest. But it's also very important work, because when what you're doing when you do exegesis is you're allowing the text to sort of work on you, right? You're trying your best not to bring your preconceived notion to the text. You're letting the text sort of teach you. And part of exegetical work is what we do with all the different forms of criticism that we use, right? Some of it is language, some of it is context, some of it it's the ideological criticism. All those kinds of things are all part of exegetical work. So that what you get then is you read the text, and then as you study through it, you begin to reveal out of the text, the X part, out of the text, comes the revelation. Eisegesis is the opposite of that. That's where I decide what the text means ahead of time, kind of, or I have my ideas, and so I'm going to make sure that that's what I see, right? So that's a struggle that a lot of churches and a lot of denominations and a lot of pastors have, is that they're doing eisegesis on a weekly basis rather than actually going to the text and digging through the text and letting the text kind of speak. But it's not really taught a whole lot in like Bible schools and stuff like that. It's, you go to seminary, you go to college. My son took it in undergrad, so, but that's what you guys will be doing. We're doing exegetical work, right? So as we read through, we're going to pick some of this stuff up and just kind of draw from. Okay, so a pronouncement or a portent or an oracle or a Massah on Nineveh, the book of the prophecy of Nahum, the Elokoshite, right? So there is no Elkosh. It does not exist. So wherever he was from, it wasn't Elkosh because there is no such place ever in the history of ever. So it's a play on words, actually. The God who, sort of like the God who makes hard, right? So what that comes from is sort of like the, Nineveh. So this is the opposite of Jonah, right? So Nineveh had their hearts hardened, by God, right? So remember I don't know if you guys remember this, if you've ever heard this before, but in the book of Exodus, it just keeps saying that every time there were all these plagues. So, if you're not too familiar with Exodus, you can kind of remember the 10 Commandments. Like there was like a plague after plague after plague, right? And then every time Pharaoh would say, yes, go ahead, get rid of the flies, get rid of the lice, get rid of the frogs, get rid of the whatever, the darkness, all the stuff. Then I'll let you go. And then it would say in the text, God hardened Pharaoh's heart, which is always troublesome to me, right? But at any rate, that's kind of where this comes from. So Elkosh, there's no such thing as, no such place as Elkosh. And we don't know anything about Nahum either. There's nothing about Nahum. Nothing. So whoever Nahum was, he was not from Elkosh, we know that. Yeah.
So there wasn't Jonah, but there wasn't a Nahum that we know of.
So we don't really know anything about Jonah either. We don't know anything, but we know less about Nahum, right? So at least we know where Jonah kind of went. Nahum is just speaking. We'd have no idea, but the tradition says that there was a person that was speaking, but the play on words there for the place where he was from is obviously, it's one of those indicators, like if you're doing sort of literary criticism of this, you start to work through it as a piece of literature. It's like a little signpost that's telling you something about the text, right? Okay, obviously, wherever this guy was, whoever he was from, there was something that he was saying about himself. So the word Nahum, let's see, what does it mean? Did I put it in here? I didn't. It means consolation. Yeah, like take comfort, right? So anyway, there it is, consolation. Yeah. Okay. All right. So verse 2. This is what verse 2. The Lord is a passionate, avenging God. The Lord is vengeful and fierce in wrath. The Lord takes vengeance on his enemies. He rages against his foes. All right. So it's Nochim Yahweh. Nochim Yahweh. Nochim Yahweh. 3 times. God is vengeful. So obviously, Nahum is making a point to say it 3 times. Okay. So, verse 3, the Lord is slow to anger and of great forbearance, but the Lord does not remit all punishment. He travels in whirlwind and storm, and the clouds are the dust on his feet. Okay, so we are in serious poetic land right now. right? He rebukes the sea and dries it up, and he makes all rivers fail. Bashan and Carmel languish, and the blossoms of Lebanon wither. Okay, so there's some interesting stuff that's going on here. So the sea, Yam, and rivers, Nakar, what this does is it really shows God's mastery over other gods, because the rivers were associated with a couple of different gods. And let's see here. Extra word continued. No Kim, Yan. All right, so we've got Baal, the storm god, which we've encountered throughout the text. I mean, when you go through the Bible, you'll see Baal everywhere, particularly in the stories about Elijah and the prophets of Baal. The rider of the clouds, and then also the god Marduk, who was like one of the oldest Mesopotamian gods, who defeats the goddess of watery chaos, Tiamat. And so what this says about God is that God is so powerful that God can make all rivers fail, rebuke the sea and dry it up. And then Bashan and Carmel. Bashan is it's probably, we're more familiar with Mount Carmel, right? Because Mount Carmel is where Elijah and the prophets of Baal had their showdown in 1 Kings. Bashan is also an area that's kind of near where you would find the modern day Golan Heights. Okay, and so these are very sort of fertile areas. They get a little more rain than some of the other areas. For those of you who've been to Mount Carmel with me, what did you think of that whole area when you were there? Like, what did it look like to you as you got up on top of remember the monastery when we got up? What was that?
Gorgeous.
Yeah, it was a lot of dang trees, weren't there?
Yeah.
It was lush, right? It was like forest.
Yeah.
Now, some of that is the reforestation that the nation of Israel has done, which they're constantly planting trees. But that area has always been that way. And so what the author is doing is saying, this is how powerful God is. He can take even the most lush areas and make them, dry up. There's also something to be said here by his mention of Carmel, which is interesting, and the connection with Baal and Marduk that just occurred to me. So I'm going to go with it for a second, all right? So one of the things that that the prophets of Israel often did was they would connect something that was happening in the moment with something that had happened before, to kind of help remind people. So the language that he's using at this point is language that would connect the defeat of Nineveh with like older defeats, which is why he's pulling in Bashan and Carmel and the blossoms of Lebanon. All those areas are right there where the prophets of Baal and Elijah had their showdown. The mountains quake, it says in verse 5. Because of him, the hills melt. The earth heaves before him, the world and all that dwell therein. What does that give you an image of, really? Like, as you're reading that, like, kind of what does that make you think of?
Earthquake.
Yeah, but like, what's happening that caused the earthquake?
Earthquake.
Anger.
What's that?
Anger.
Okay. Think poetry.
God shaking the world.
Okay, so if you want to shake the world, you have to be kind of close to it, right? So what would be kind of happening in this point? The earth heaves before him, right? So he's walking, right? This is a warrior that is marching, right? So this is the images that he's portraying here of the warrior God, who is. We do this, right? I just got through watching Aladdin. We went to the movie Aladdin, right? And so the genie gets like really huge at one point, right? And is like walking through, so whenever you see those movies where like something like that happens, that's the image that the author is like, the God is like, moving. Who can stand before his wrath? Who can resist his fury? His anger pours out like fire, and the rocks are shattered because of him. The Lord is good to those who hope in him, a haven on a day of distress. He is mindful of those who seek refuge in him. And with a sweeping flood. So there's like that little moment right there. But then it like skips. And with a sweeping flood, he makes an end of her place. Okay, so this is a disputed text. What do you guys have in yours?
It's the end
He
of
will make
it.
an end of the place.
Okay? So some translations have adversaries, some have foes, some have Nineveh. They went ahead and just decided that that's what that means. In the actual Hebrew, it's her place. It's a feminine word. So we can assume that that's what he's talking about, is talking about Nineveh. And chases, so in the meaning is uncertain of that, which also, if you kind of start pulling some of the words apart, it can mean those who oppose him as well. So that people have translated it different ways, right? So a haven on a day of distress. With a sweeping flood, he makes an end of her place and chases his enemies into darkness. Why will you plot against the Lord? He wreaks utter destruction. No adversary opposes him twice. Right, so here we are in verse 10. This is really interesting. For like men besotted with drink, they are burned up like tangled thorns, like straw that is thoroughly dried. Right, so obviously he's a better prophet than a poet because he's using mixed metaphors, which just really stinks. Like, I'm like, come on, man. Just go ahead and go with the besotted with drink. You could have just kind of continued. But now all of a sudden you're shifting and making it, they're like a fully packed heap of dry straw, right? So there's a disparagement against the Assyrian army at that point, right? You're just a bunch of drunks. You can't defend it. It's going to go up like kindling, right? The base plotter. Okay, so this is really interesting. What does it say in verse 11 for some of you? Kind of spit that out.
From you, O Nineveh,
From you, O Nineveh. What's another one?
has
Has
one
one
come.
come out of thee.
Has one come out of thee? Okay. So the Hebrew, kind of direct Hebrew, is the base plotter, right? Which is an individual who designed evil against the Lord has left you. Thus said the Lord, even as they were full and many, even so they are over and gone. As surely as I afflicted you, I will afflict you no more. Right? So the base plotter, some scholars suggest that the prophet is actually referring to the king of Nineveh. Maybe an archetypal king, right? Maybe, like a Sennacherib. Or it could have been like directly related to the story that I just told, right? The king left you. The king went up in flames, right? Thus said the Lord, even as they were full. Okay, so blah, 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 blah. Okay, so that was 12. I will afflict you no more. And now I will break off his yoke bar from you and burst your cords apart. Okay, so the idea of that is whatever your translation says, the idea is of snapping the cords of a harnessed animal, right? You're no longer going to be yoked to them. You're no longer going to have to pull the cart, right? It's a familiar image in Akkadian and Assyrian literature and wisdom literature, this idea of bursting cords and being set free. So the prophet is actually using poetic language that Assyrians would use. So he's just basically giving them the finger right there. Then it says in verse 14, the Lord has commanded concerning him, right? Kind of going back to the base plotter. No posterity shall continue your name. I will do away with the carved and graven images in the temples of your gods. I will make your grave accord with your worthlessness. So there's the word there, I think, in accord with your worthlessness. The word that is used sometimes kind of drawn out of that is the word Belial. So the reason why Belial is there, because Belial is a name that's used throughout the centuries in the ancient world to indicate the evil one, to indicate somebody who's completely overcome by evil, and most likely evil leaders. In fact, all the way down into Roman times, there would be references to Belial as one of the Roman emperors, Nero specifically. Okay, so let's go through some of the commentary. Okay, that we've already sort of talked about that. So Nineveh is kind of a. Remember, I told you that cities often stood for different things in Hebrew literature. So Babylon stood for the warfare of man against God. So it's sort of like the pride. There's a wonderful story in Daniel about Nebuchadnezzar, how he goes mad, and kind of loses his mind for a while, and then acknowledges God, which, I mean, whether it happened or not, who knows? I mean, but the idea there is that Babylon waged war against humankind, and then God could easily bring Babylon to its knees, and does eventually. But that's kind of what Babylon was all about, of excess, and the exile, of course, was huge in the mind of the people of Israel. By the rivers of Babylon, we wept as they were brought out of Jerusalem and into exile. So Nineveh, by contrast, stands for the warfare of man against human beings. Did I say Babylon the other way? Babylon was a war of man against God. Nineveh was man against human beings. So it's a dualistic book. I mean, there's no gray areas here, is there? I mean, you're either for God or against God. If you're for God, things are great. There's that little tiny spot where it says, He is mindful of those. The Lord is good to those who hope in Him, a haven on a day of distress. He is mindful of those who seek refuge in Him, and with a sweeping flood He makes an end. But then it just goes right into destruction, right? So the people who are reading this, they're being reminded that you are okay, right? Because your hope is in God, but not Nineveh, right? Nineveh is done for. So God rewards the righteous and punishes the enemy. I mean, it's a problematic text for that purpose, right? Because what about the people that were innocent, right? The people that are mentioned in Jonah, when he says, why shouldn't I care about all these people, men and women and children and animals? So the question that we have to start asking is this a book about human revenge, or is it a book about God? And what does it say if it is a book about God, which I believe that it is? But what does it say about the author's understanding of God? So let's kind of deal with that just a bit before we kind of dig farther into the stuff, right? So what do you guys think so far from what we've read, from what we've kind of touched on? What do you think of this? And what do we do with it?
I think Jonah and Nahum are two of a kind. It's just their interpretation of God that varies, I think. I mean, it seems like they both hated with a vengeance Nineveh and the Assyrians, but in one, God is merciful, becomes merciful. It does spare those who believe. In the other one, He's not sparing. So it's
Okay, so let's kind of think about that, because you've got two books that are said to be prophetic, right? They're both minor prophets, is what their technical term is within the Old Testament, right? The Hebrew Scriptures. So minor prophets, and yet both of them have it's kind of, I mean, you kind of have to sort of squish them into the prophet mold, right, to make it fit, because there's issues with it. So Jonah is not the narrator in the book of Jonah. There's an outside narrator, right? So there's an outside narrator that is interpreting what's going on to a certain extent, or telling you the story. Jonah doesn't speak except And I think you're right. So in terms of where Jonah's coming from, Jonah wants Nineveh to be destroyed, is really excited about it. Probably if it had happened, then Jonah might have created his own song to celebrate. There is some liturgical aspects to Jonah as well, right? When he's in the belly of the whale, he begins to pray, and there's a liturgy that's part of that, which is connected to Nahum. But it's always about what Jonah is doing. Somebody is reporting what Jonah's doing. Nahum is just basically speaking, right? So it's coming out of the mouth of Nahum, which, that makes a big difference in the way that these... So, yeah, you're right. Both of them probably had very similar ideas, but there's no... Like in Jonah, you get God's point of view, which is different than Jonah's. And here, Nahum's point of view is the same as God's, right? At least, and that's what Nahum is representing. Nahum is representing that whatever Nahum is saying is what God has done, right? So that's a huge difference between the two of them, even though they're probably coming, you're right, the characters themselves, Nahum and Jonah, are probably coming at it from the same point of view. You don't get any break in Nahum. Yeah. There's no alternative, right? There's no but yet God relented and God changed God's mind and blah 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 blah. There's nothing of that in there. It's done, right?
Oh, I had one more
Yeah,
question,
sure.
just quickly. Why, if Egypt was so horrendous to them, why is Nineveh any different than any of their other enemies that battered them around back and forth all through history? I mean, what made them even worse?
They weren't any worse than anybody else, but I think, like what happens is when within a particular historical context, they can take on sort of mythic, kind of a mythic role, so to speak. Just like Babylon becomes a mythological sort of place even long after it's been destroyed, or it's been conquered again and again and again. So in the book of Revelation, then the author of Revelation connects Rome with Babylon. This is the new Babylon, right? Then now there are lots of people who would have a new Babylon even now, right? Which would be who? Us,
US.
right? So we are Babylon. Right, to a lot of people, they look and they see the decadence and the excess and all the other kind of stuff, right? So, we're just living our lives. I think there's probably lots of people in Babylon that were just like getting up every day and, going and selling fish and, you know what I mean? Building crap and do you know what I'm saying? So but yet, within a particular historical context, that takes on that mythic proportion, just like Egypt did, right? Because Egypt was a place of slavery for them where there was no rest. There was no respite from the economic drive that basically was the empire was built on the backs of slave labor, which was us, right? And so, even long after all of that is over, they look back to Egypt and they use Egypt as an archetype kind of, we don't ever want to go back there, right? We don't ever want to, and yet here they are, in whatever year that was, in, let's see, 701, right? Here they are in league with the Egyptians, which is what and then again in when Babylon sacks Jerusalem, they're again in league with the Egyptians again. So that same kind of stuff happens, right?
I'm sure I'm missing something really obvious here, but did God destroy Nineveh or not?
That's a good question.
That's what I was gonna ask. Was there a time when Nineveh was horrible and God saved Nineveh? And then later they forgot that and they got horrible again? And then this is going on?
That is a way to that is how a lot of people, I think, would interpret the text.
How could they experience that kind of redemption and then go back to being horrible?
Okay, so this is one of the many problems of reading this literally, right? Of reading Jonah literally and then reading this literally too. It's one of the many problems that you encounter is the inconsistencies. So being able to read it spiritually and to dig kind of deeper and not get lost in the weeds of did God really save Nineveh? Did God really destroy Nineveh? Being able to go underneath the surface and read it from the context of who would have been writing this and reading it and how would they have interpreted it. So how they would have interpreted it is exactly that, right? They would have interpreted it as God gave them a break, right? But there was probably some other things that we can learn from the book of Jonah as well, that there's something there about us being prophets or priests, a priestly nation, right? There's an exhortation in Jonah that you need to be better. You need to have grace and forgiveness. You know, do you know what I mean? Like you need to be better at your job, and you let me do mine. So that was part of that, but
The book of Judges is a good example of,
right, of all kinds of madness.
yeah, I mean, Israel continuously was saved and then lapsed right back into.
Okay, so let's go with all that, right? Let's go with that because, like, when you think about modern times, right, and things that happen in the world, and you know the wars that are fought and won and lost, and all the rest of it, right? So the narrative that we would have as a nation is that World War II, right? When we look at World War II, we look at that with a very sort of idealized, in a very idealized kind of way, because we won. I mean, and we were on the right, right?
Victor writes history.
But we were in the right.
Well, that's right.
Right?
That's why we look at it in, I don't know if it's an idealized way. But
No, but I
proud
mean,
of it.
yeah, we're proud of it because we
There
were,
were issues of good and evil. And
Right.
we were on the side. Exactly, but I think Bob is absolutely right. If you look at the Old Testament, it's the story of the Jewish people doing something to anger God and kind of working that through, be it in a desert or wherever, you know, coming close to the promised land and then failing God again.
okay, so remember what we said like 2 times ago, right? That another way of sort of looking at this too is that, you know, like what I told you guys, like, do you believe now that God hates groups of people and wants to destroy them? I mean, so we don't believe that, right? But these people did. I mean, they just did. They also believed that any calamity that happened to them because they weren't faithful. You know, that they had gone away from the faith, right? Now, it's sort of easy when something like that happens, when a tragedy or a calamity happens. You know, there's always people that will step into that and say, if we had done this, right, then, you know, it wouldn't have happened. Or, you know, like we talked about it, like when 9/11 happened, there was like the Jerry Falwells and the Pat Robertsons that came on and said, you know, the reason why this happened is because we are decadent and, you know, issues of, you know, we're too soft on sexuality and blah, 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 blah. So, you know, is it outside of the realm of possibility that every sort of calamity that happened to a tiny little nation that was in the midst of all of these superpowers, and every time something happened where they were taken over or where they were oppressed or something, that they would then begin to interpret that in a way where they're like, we are being punished. And then maybe there was something to the fact that when they were actually doing what they were supposed to do and following their own their laws and the laws that had been given to them, and that they were living peacefully with their neighbors, when they were welcoming the stranger, when they were doing all the things that they were supposed to do, that things actually went better. Because you know what? When you do stuff that God tells you to do, when you live right, when you do the things that you're supposed to do as a nation, and you're righteous and you are generous and you are, you know what I mean, all the things, when you're not waging war, you tend to get along with people, and they don't kick your butt every 5 seconds, right? And even in the times when the Babylonian captivities and so forth, ahead of time, the prophets were saying, just be at peace. And then they were going back and saying, you know why this happened? It's because you didn't take care of widows and orphans. You didn't welcome the stranger. You didn't do that. You didn't do that. You know what I mean? And so there's straight up truth in that, isn't there? So it's a yes and kind of thing, right? Instead of a yes but. It's like, did they fall into problems when they didn't do what they were supposed to? Yes. Was it a direct punishment of God? I would think God would be like, no, I wasn't punishing them. They just punished themselves by doing stupid crap. Do you know what I'm saying?
Sound like a parent talking to a teenager.
Well, what do you think God does, right? God's like, I don't want you to, come on, you know? And so then the interpretation of that becomes, that's where, but as people begin to wake up over time and to understanding of God, and they wake up more and that's what the Bible really is. It's the story of people who are waking up. And Jesus was like the most woke person ever, right?
Consequences for your behavior.
Right. So, I think, so back to what you were talking about, did this happen? I think it happened. Whether God caused it or not, that's a debate that I'm not going to wade into. My personal belief is that God doesn't cause those things. But I will say this, the interpretations of those things are the scholars believe the interpretations and how people viewed it are almost as important as, or maybe more so than anything that we might be able to gain out of, debating whether it really happened or not.
In Jonah, it didn't happen.
In Jonah, it didn't happen because they repented. I mean, that's the text, right? In Nahum, it did. There wasn't even a chance to repent in Nahum.
It's like an allegory.
There's no point in Nahum where it says, yeah, you guys, I tried to save you, and you went back to where you were before. There's none of that. It's just Nineveh stinks. I'm killing them all, right? They got their just desserts.
Maybe the lesson is that this is judgment, not punishment.
That's interesting. Say more about that.
Well, to me, a vengeful God is one who gets mad for any old reason.
Right?
A venging God is one who has a reason for
Okay.
passing judgment.
Okay.
To me, those two, vengeful and avenging are kind of two different things.
Yeah.
And so maybe when Jonah went to Nineveh, God gave him a chance to be redeemed,
Mm-hmm.
to say they were sorry for their sins and to try and live better. And as she said, people are people and they fall back into their old ways. And maybe God decided that, especially since he had already forgiven Nineveh once, that this could be a good example of just judgment.
Okay. So, all right. So here's what I really think is super interesting about what you were saying. So there's part of it. So I'm going to put my cards on the table. Like I'm not necessarily buying into the idea that that God is sort of saying, I gave you a chance and now you've messed up, and so now I'm gonna, I'm not buying into that. But I have my own reasons, and that's just, that's where I'm standing. But I do think that you could read it that way, and that that's perfectly fine. But I actually like what you were saying about judgment, and kind of an avenging sort of way. That's super interesting, because here's why. I think every single one of us wants a God that is going to exact justice, right? That there's some judgment that's involved, because there's lots of rotten things in the world that need to be set right. It would kind of stink to believe in a God that doesn't ever finally go, okay,
Well,
you know.
but to go back to what
But-
you were saying about, you have to think about how the people who were reading the stories
Right.
would understand them. And if they have clear examples of same place, one situation, nothing happens. Same place, different situation, something does happen.
Right.
That's a lesson that everyone can apply to their own lives.
True. You know, and the other thing that we also have to take into consideration is that the people who were reading the book of Jonah very well could have seen it as, you know, an allegory. You know, they could have seen it that way and it would have been okay. They would not have been troubled by that. You know, we're the ones that want it to be a real person because of and that honestly is because of the Enlightenment. You know, there has to be evidence, there has to be something to back it up. The ancient Hebrew people would have been less concerned with that. But the truth of that still is there. I mean, you know, in the one hand, you have an image of God where God saves these people, and then the other one where he doesn't. And actually, it's the opposite. God exacts vengeance, and God has judgment on them. Those are the images that we have that are disparate images, right? And so we're not going to reconcile those, okay? So I mean, this is part of the problem that we have with this whole class is that there's no reconciliation here. Try as we might to try to figure out how to do this. It's hard to figure out how to, but I think what you're talking about comes close, right? So the idea of a God who wants justice, and you know, it's sort of like, dadgummit, I don't know why. It was like, okay, the Avengers, right? So the very first Avengers movie, you know, like things are not great, right? The world is about to be destroyed, right? So they're either going to save the world or we will avenge it, right? So that's where they got their name, the Avengers. They'll avenge the destruction of the world. So there's something about that calls to us deep inside, right? So I think what you're tapping into is something very important to the people who are here. If you see your hated enemy get theirs, there's got to be something about that, right? Okay, so I hate the Kansas City Chiefs, okay? Like, passionately hate the Kansas City Chiefs. I will give you all my reasons. First of all, I'm a Denver Broncos fan, so it's required. Second, I don't know, they stole my college's fight song thing that we do. Like blatantly stole it. You know, like they like go, but they do it like in a weird way that's not right because they're Chiefs fans and they can't count or something. I have no idea. So when they lose, like I almost get more joy out of the fact that they lost. Like when they got bounced from the playoffs by the Patriots and like Tom Brady, like I can't stand Tom Brady, but Tom Brady, like that was the one time my whole life I've cheered for Tom Brady, and he put a dagger into the Chiefs' hearts and just like, I mean, the whole city just went, ooh. And every Broncos fan everywhere was like, yes, in your face, right? See what I mean?
See what I mean? Do you realize this is going to be broadcast?
Sorry, Rob Johnson. He'll never watch it.
Devotion.
So I mean, so take it away from sports and take it to, put it on like a group of people, put it on like a nation, put it on something. I mean, you know, when you're, you know, when Berlin fell, there were, you know, when Germany was destroyed, essentially, I mean, you know, there were parades in America, you know, because the war was over. Now we were, you know, I mean, obviously we still had to keep fighting the Japanese, but, you know, I mean, we dropped 2 atomic bombs that killed innocent people, lots of them. Now we say all kinds of things to justify that. And there's lots of good arguments for that. You know, that decision may have saved a lot of other people's lives too, right? You know, so those are the decisions that were made. They were made. It happened. It was done. But there was rejoicing when those things happened. It was only afterwards, as we started taking, you know, like now we go and you can go to Hiroshima, you can go to Nagasaki, you can see the, you know, and now Americans will stand side by side with Japanese to see that and to realize that there's a toll but at the time we didn't think that, you know. I mean, so there's, you know, you think about these people, right, that see their hated enemy that had destroyed, and all the stories and all the stuff and all of the things, I mean, everything, all the history of it. And to watch that city go up in flames and to see it happen so spectacularly, you know, they're like, that is the vengeance of God on them, right?
I think you see
It's realistic. It's realistic for us to feel that. Yeah.
with little kids. I mean, the first time you have to tell your kid that life is not fair, and it isn't fair,
Right.
and that's very distressing. But then they see whatever the issue is, the person being punished, or, you know, somehow it's made right, and it just kind of makes the world make sense again.
It does.
You know, it kind of
It sets
pulls it out.
there's a cognitive dissonance that occurs when what you think to be true and what you actually experience to be true are different. And that has to be resolved, right? Your head has to resolve it in some way. And so a lot of times what we do is we resolve it by attaching meaning to it and doing those kinds of things. It's human nature to want to do that. And, you know, it's also human nature to want to believe that there's a divine intervention in that. But here's the problem that we have with that. Now, I'm going to also go into the other part of it too, okay? So hold on. The idea that God punished violence and oppression with violence and oppression implicates God in human acts of violence and death-dealing destruction. And so what happens is then, as the reader of this text, then you have a huge role as the arbiter of God's enemies, because then you also are going to be saying, well, who else is God's enemy? Right? Who else are the enemies of God? If Nineveh was the enemy of God and the enemy of God has now been destroyed, who else is the enemy of God? Okay. So here's something fascinating, right? A lot of the text and a lot of the stuff that was being written that came out of the Babylonian captivity, there's a lot of language about how the Babylonians were used by God as instruments of judgment. Cyrus then becomes lionized. So this is a conquering king, right, who has taken over Babylon, Cyrus of Persia, who is given almost like, he's given the David treatment, right, in the text, because Cyrus allows the Israelites to return back to Jerusalem, or some of them.
God said, I'll give you the treasures of the world.
Right. But yet, it's still an empire. It's still a, you know, I mean, there's, you know what I mean? So it's really interesting, like, kind of, because when they're writing about, when they're within the captivity, they have a different spin on it because they're within the captivity. So if you're going to be writing and you're going to be thinking and writing, you know, whatever you're writing, you got to be careful how you phrase it within the, you know, to the people that are over you, right? But it's a different kind of mentality. And Nineveh gets judgment. Eventually, Babylon gets judgment too, you know, but that's much later. Okay, so the reader then has a huge role as the arbiter of God's enemies. Okay, so this is a figure here, like this warrior sort of God, is almost more demonic than godlike. And so it's kind of hard to believe that even in Nahum's time that this was all that could be said about God. That there were other things, other people that were saying other things about God at the same time. You know, Nahum almost uses the same kind of language that the people of the area would have used about their own God being a warrior and coming in and destroying things. So let's think then about the people of Nineveh. Let's think about Nineveh itself, right? Because there's another side to it, as we've all been talking about and talking around it. So we have the problem with the images that are here that are kind of, hard for us to sort of put our minds around, and we've been trying to do that. We have the images of Nineveh, and you're sort of like, well, there seems to be some vengeance going on. So this is where this ties into this, right? Because this was not a harassed small group of people, these Ninevites. This was an empire, and it had a history. So if you want to think about a history of an empire that got its comeuppance, think South Africa, right, and the apartheid government. There are no sad songs being sung about the apartheid time period, or the Nazis. I mean, we watch show after show, movie after movie. I mean, it's still a cottage industry, isn't it? I mean, I watched a movie just last year about how they got Eichmann. The group, the kind of the early Mossad guys that went and got Eichmann out of where was it? It was in Argentina. I mean, that was crazy, And you think about that, like that was in the '60s, right? Like early '60s, and so you're still like we're still making movies, we're still thinking about that. That looms large in our. So you want to talk about like dancing on the grave of an empire. And even the empire itself, Germany itself, has had to come to grips with its own past.
We just recently had a German concentration guard sent back to Germany, I believe it was.
From here.
He's lived in Detroit for years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we're kind of doing the same thing.
I don't see us as dancing on the grave.
No. But what do you mean? You do see what I'm saying? Like we're rejoicing. We rejoice that was over. We watch the atrocities. We don't want it to happen again.
I don't see a dancing or rejoicing. I guess I think we make sense of it. We want to know more about it for people my age, and that was my parents' generation.
Right.
And they lived through that, so that was an incredibly important story, an incredibly important American story.
And I'm not taking anything away from that. What I'm saying
is I don't think there's a rejoicing aspect as we look to all of these things. I think.
Well, would you agree that?
Forgetting.
Would you agree that it's sort of like this happened because they did these things, right? This was an evil. Okay, so that's essentially what's happening here, right? There's a decadent, evil sort of group of people. So Rudyard Kipling actually, this was this is a prophetic, sort of a more modern prophetic word that came from Kipling himself as he saw what was going on with England and their colonization of some of the places, particularly India, which he had a deep love for India. And so he got a lot of garbage from this poem that he wrote that was published and was out during like the one of the celebrations of Victoria's reign. It was like one of the, I don't know which one it was, like 50th year or something. I don't know how long she reigned. Not as long as Queen Elizabeth II, obviously, but. So he says, far called our navies melt away, right? So what is he saying there, right? You're stretched thin, right? On dune and headland sinks the fire. Lo, all our pomp of yesterday is one with Nineveh and Tyre. Judge of the nations, God, right? Spare us yet, lest we forget, lest we forget. And so, England had its own issues, and as an empire, and the same kind of thing, I think, in a lot of ways happened. The sun never sets on the Union Jack, right? Well, now it does.
Yes.
And the same thing will be true for us, right? So here's a little aside as we kind of come to the end of this, and we'll do a little Q&A. But what time is it, by the way?
7:30.
Okay, we'll blow through this really fast. So this is one of the only two prophetic books in the entire Old Testament that is not included in the Revised Common Lectionary. So it is in the Revised Common Lectionary. It is never preached on. This and Obadiah. So those two, because they avoided them like the plague, I guess. I don't know why they just didn't want to. So what's, just really quickly, like what still troubles you from this? No, we're not done. We've got two more sessions on Nahum. So we're gonna dig into more and more of what has happened, why Nineveh got sacked, and what was really at the heart of it, and then some other things as well, and some awful stuff, like the heaps of corpses, dead bodies without number. They stumble over bodies. It's amazing. So this is all great stuff. And then there's a lot of really hard imagery that we're going to dig into that will be hard to read because of the way that it uses language that is violent to women. Right? So it's difficult stuff. So we're not through being troubled, but if there's anything that's still troubling you today,
But the
What do we-
question about how could they, they repented and then 100 years later they were saying, you just look at what has changed in our lives in the last, even my lifetime, 71 years. I said all of a sudden what was not accepted back then now is accepted. Would they judge that as not being, so I mean, we've changed a lot in the.
and I think, yeah, you're right. And we've grown up some. We've grown up some. Even in the wars that, so my dad was a Vietnam vet. Any other Vietnam vets in here?
My ex-husband.
Yeah. And so when I was in like high school, that was kind of when we started to reset that. But it wasn't until I was in high school. So that was like 1985, 86, right in there. Because up until then, we'd had it, you know what I mean? So we've grown up from that, realizing that there's a difference, that the people who fought, deserved, they deserved better than what they got. And so there was a Chuck Norris movie that was out then, and then there was the first, one of the First Blood movies, one of the the Rambo movies. That was a beginning of a different conversation that was occurring. So we had these really positive sort of patriotic feelings, and rightly so, about the World War II vets and the Greatest Generation, all that. But now we're growing up as we begin to reset those things and to realize
Storm was the big.
that was another one.
Big changing attitude towards the Vietnam vet.
It started to change dramatically then. And so as a nation we're starting to figure some things out. But I think that kind of as we think about this, there's a prophecy there that comes from the Rudyard Kipling poem as well as from Nahum, right? That at some point, if you don't do what you're supposed to do, you're going to find yourself on the dustbin of history.
He said a lot of things that were.
Right. Yeah,
Quickly,
one last thing.
it reminds me when you were talking about judgment and everything, and it kind of, and whether they were forgiven and then they started again and they weren't. It's almost like being a parent.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I wasn't always consistent. One day, if they threw the ball in the house, I'd be, okay, and I'd be busy and I'd be fine. The next day,
Yes.
don't you ever throw that ball in the house again. I've told you a million times not to do that.
Right.
It's very...
So really quickly, okay, let's assume then the same thing that we were assuming about the people of Israel, right? So let's assume that God is for Nineveh, right? Let's take Jonah's word for it, or the book, right? So let's assume that God is for Nineveh. God loves them, right? So that's our belief, right? We're like, that's what we want to believe, right? So let's say that was a moment when they repented and they're so there's this connection. The same thing is true for them as was true for Israel. So however you interpret what happened, God didn't want. I'm just that's what my belief is, that whatever Nahum is struggling with, I don't think God wanted them to be destroyed. God didn't cause them to be destroyed. They were destroyed because of the fact that they were decadent and you know what I mean? Yeah. They went against all of the things, which is like, that's true for every empire. That's true for all of us, that we can find ourselves in bad situations. So anyway, that's a good.
Out of school.
Well, we kick God out of everything, right?
Now look what we got.
Actually, the interesting thing is that, we think we kick God out of everything. God's like, really?
Yeah.
Just try.
You think you are.
Right? All right, well, let me send you guys off into the night with a blessing. God, go before us, be around us and in us and through us, and we pray that your Spirit would guide us in all that we do, that we would strive to be your children and to do what it is that you would have us to do, to see the world through your eyes, and Lord, to continue to grow in our faith and our understanding of you. We pray all these things in your Son's name. Amen. Have a great day, night, whatever.